Tonight, our special guest is Dr. Danielle Powell, an audiologist and epidemiologist. As a clinician scientist, her research interests are driven by her past experience as a practicing clinician. She obtained her doctorate in audiology from the University of North Carolina and a PhD in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. With training, she also had training in health services research for older adults. Her research focuses on understanding the impacts of hearing loss on older adults, like most of us, and how they interact with the health system. Accompanying Dr. Powell this evening is Ariella Sapoznik, who is currently a Doctor of Audiology student at the University of Maryland, working as part of Dr. Powell's research team. Dr. Powell will review the basics of hearing loss and discuss general symptoms and effects on health and quality of life for those who have hearing concerns. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Powell and Ms. Sapoznik to Asbury.
Thank you all. I am Danielle Powell. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Maryland. Like she said, my background is initially as a clinician, but I also am currently doing, I can't see you all now, more research. But everything that I will talk about and presented is coming from my clinical experiences and lens. I'll let you introduce yourself again.
I'm Ariella. I'm a third-year doctorate student from the University of Maryland. I'm from this area originally and then did my undergrad as well at University of Maryland.
So she's along for the additional enrichment experience of talking to all of you as well today. Sorry, thank you for that reminder. Just as doing my due diligence as a university affiliate faculty member, I have no disclosures. And to get us started, knowing that everyone kind of maybe has a different experience related to hearing loss or awareness of what we mean when we say hearing loss, Ariella will kind of give a brief background understanding of kind of what hearing loss is and how might it impact you.
Okay. So hearing loss, as some of you may know, it affects nearly 2/3 of individuals aged 70 and older. So overall, I want to talk to you a little bit about hearing loss and presbycusis. So presbycusis is an age-related type of hearing loss. Hearing often changes gradually as we age. This is a common condition that usually affects both ears at the same time. And it usually can affect you when you're in noisy places, for example, a restaurant, things like that. It may be harder to follow conversation. Hearing loss is manageable, and addressing it can help you stay engaged and connected and maintain a quality of life. So this is an audiogram. This is typically what you will see if you go to an audiologist and they test your hearing. Some of you may have seen this before. So overall, what happens, you go in for a hearing test. They'll give you a button or they'll ask you to raise your hand every time you hear the beeps, even if the beeps are really quiet. We mark your hearing based on this scale, so it goes from normal to profound hearing loss, based on the quietest that you can hear. On the other side, you can see similar graph, but you can see that yellow kind of like banana shape. That's what we call the speech banana. So based off of your hearing loss, we can highlight which parts of speech you're missing out on. So recognizing hearing loss, some common signs that you might see or you might feel. You may feel withdrawn from conversation or group activities. You may ask others to repeat themselves. You may have some difficulty following conversation in noisy environments. You may have some trouble hearing when someone speaks from another room or from behind you or far away. You may turn the TV or the radio volume up higher than others prefer. And you may often have frequent comments that Others are mumbling when maybe they aren't actually mumbling. So how to manage hearing loss? There's a few ways to manage hearing loss. You can have assistive devices such as hearing aids or cochlear implants. There's remote microphones that someone can wear if they're talking to you. You can hear them through that remote microphone. There's captioned telephones, so while you're on the phone with somebody, it can be having captions tell you what that person is saying so you can read it at the same time. There's also TV streamers. So you can have something that's called TV ears, which are just headphones that you wear, and it streams the audio directly to those headphones. Or another option is you can have a plug-in TV streamer that goes from the TV to your hearing aids. Another option for people that have hearing loss is communication strategies. So these are some strategies that you can use if you struggle with conversation in those background noise environments. So you can move further away from background noise. Easier said than done, that's not always necessarily possible. So something else that you can do is you can face your communication partner when speaking to them. Another aspect is choosing a well-lit environment. Although you may not realize it, you're often using context clues with their mouth to understand what they're saying. You may not think you're lip reading, but you can use those context clues and actually help you. So how hearing loss affects health and the quality of life. So you may have some cognitive decline that comes along with some hearing loss. That could include dementia. Depression and anxiety can come along with hearing loss, communication problems, functional decline. You may have some less physical activity or may be at risk for falls. There's also personal and financial impacts that could come with hearing loss. You may have increased use of healthcare services, so you may be going to health providers more often. You may have higher healthcare costs, less earning potential. For instance, some people feel as though they have to retire. Once they have hearing loss, they can't participate as much in their work environment. And some lower educational growth potential. You may also feel isolated, as if you can't go to places because you can't hear as well. So these are just some potential possibilities that come along with it.
So just to, forget to do this. We present all of this just to give a little bit of an understanding when we go into anything else that we're talking about, specifically more related to hearing loss, cognitive decline, and dementia. And when we say hearing loss, kind of what we're referring to. I present all of these because these are things that we know or we're increasingly becoming aware of can be associated with hearing loss for individuals, especially unmanaged hearing loss. We know that individuals can be more at risk of some of these things, which is why we have a lot more attention on hearing loss in population and individuals, recognizing more and more that it affects more than just communication ability. And so trying to understand how we can better kind of promote hearing loss awareness for maintaining independence, function, quality of life, to keep people in those activities that they enjoy doing for a longer period of time. That's kind of the point of what we're presenting right here. And also recognizing that hearing loss is more than just audibility, that ability to detect sounds. It's also related to that understanding, so the ability of the brain to kind of put all of that, to take all of that sound and apply meaning to what is being done there, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. So, with that background understanding, you weren't here to hear a clinical type of talk, you were here to learn more about this. So we'll transition to kind of what do we know so far about hearing loss and dementia or cognitive decline? What do we mean when we say that? And more importantly, how can we be proactive about ensuring to the best of our own ability you can kind of maintain those activities that you enjoy doing for as long as we're able to. So to kind of put a couple of summary points on one slide for you, we know that hearing happens ultimately in the brain, while the ears and the more peripheral part of the auditory system kind of encapsulate that sound that is heard in your environment. Ultimately, how that sound is processed occurs in the brain. It requires a lot of cognitive abilities to be able to make sense even of what I'm saying right now. There's a phone or alarm going off somewhere, to be able to stay focused on what I'm saying as opposed to listening to that, excellent timing, as opposed to listening to that at the same time. If I start to talk a little bit faster and my words start to slur a little bit more just because I am on a microphone, being able to keep up with that and make sure you can tell the differences in what I'm saying requires ultimately some cognitive processing ability to do that. And that inherently is ingrained in this conversation of this link between hearing and dementia at the same time. We also know and are learning more and more that when hearing declines, the brain has to work harder to be able to fill in some of that information or put those pieces together. And I'll describe a little bit more about that. And if you have more questions about that, we have a whole host of pocket slides that get into even more detail than what I'm going to initially present, depending on what you're interested in. And then ultimately, with the brain working harder for hearing loss, we're starting to understand that over time, especially with prolonged hearing loss that we aren't doing anything about, that you're not giving brain access to that sound through opportunities and tools like hearing aids, for example, it can ultimately start to affect your cognitive health in a couple of different potential ways. What that looks like, we're still trying to understand. We can't say that hearing is causing those direct changes to cognitive health, but there is kind of increasing evidence that there is some kinds of link going on there. And then, like Ariella mentioned, the encouraging part is that hearing loss is treatable. There are things that we can do to help with kind of any decreased hearing ability, whether that's a device, whether that's some of the communication strategies or other options and tools that she presented. There are ways that we can think about this. And ultimately, that's kind of part of this bigger picture. So what do I mean when I say dementia? What is dementia? Some of you may be more familiar with this than others, depending on your own life experiences. But ultimately, dementia is a syndrome that can impact memory, thinking abilities, executive function and processing, attention, abilities, and can really affect daily living and social aspects of social life, I should say. And when we say dementia, we use that term, but it can really be, this is where moving would be helpful, a variety of different underlying what we call etiology or pathologies. So Alzheimer's disease being the most common, but what causes Alzheimer's disease itself, the changes that are happening in the brain, you might have heard of tau, plaques and tangles. Those are the etiologic, the biological things that are hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. Is increasingly common, but so are these other conditions that are fundamentally where they come from is from a different etiology, a different source. And they have different clinical presentations as far as what an individual's symptoms or signs might be. The trajectory of how long it takes to develop might be a little bit different, and what the treatment and management is for each of these is a little bit different. But what's most important is that the most common dementia is actually what we call mixed dementia. It's a combination of these different factors. And so management of dementia, if you have a diagnosis of dementia, can be increasingly complex and is very individualized, which is why one of the reasons why kind of how we approach dementia for intervention is not as straightforward as maybe some other chronic conditions that can be more common. But collectively, often what you'll see in a lot of the research that you see is either just bunching all of these together or starting to look at Alzheimer's disease itself, just because that's where a lot more of the interest is. It is very common. But if you're actually thinking about from a research and a causal type understanding, we shouldn't be lumping these together. They come from different things. But if you're thinking about kind of how somebody functions, how somebody does with whatever diagnosis they do, that's where lumping those together might have more weight to it. And so it's also important to recognize, no matter what, but including in this hearing-based conversation, that progressing to the state of dementia is not something that's going to happen to everyone. There is a long-term trajectory of what cognitive ability looks like for individuals, and a variety of different things can factor into what that trajectory looks like, some of which we'll talk about today, not just hearing stuff. And so a basic understanding, if you look at this figure, on this axis is cognitive decline, going down is poorer cognitive abilities. On this axis is just change over time. And so what we can see is for most individuals, or for every individual, just with age, with wear and tear on the body from your years of life and experience, we expect to see a normal, kind of a general decline in some cognitive abilities. What we can start to see if we see changes for what we call preclinical cognitive decline or preclinical dementia, this is what we would call a silent phase. So there are changes potentially happening in the brain, and individuals may notice a little bit of something, but it's not affecting anything in their daily lives. No one else is really affecting anything. And what makes it really hard to study aspects of dementia is that this phase can be really, really long. It can happen over decades, and often can start happening more in midlife. And people can stay in this phase until their death. It can really vary. When we start to see someone approaching a diagnosis of what we would call mild cognitive impairment, this is done based off of a combination of neuropsychological tests, which you may or may not have done, your general cognitive screenings like the MOCA or the MMSC, which you may have done at your primary care appointment. These are the really quick screenings that you can do. Drawing a clock, for example, is one of those screeners that they can do. And we start to see some changes that might be of a little bit of a concern to the individual or the family, but they don't really get in the way of your everyday function. You're able to go about your regular, what we call activities of daily living with minimal to no support. But certain aspects of what we call cognitive domains, those aspects of cognition, whether it's memory, attention, visual spatial understanding, executive function, some aspects of those are starting to be a little bit affected. And an individual can progress to a diagnosis of dementia when their aspects of daily function start to be affected. And this diagnosis is related to a combination of different factors, including person and family-based perceptions of functional ability, potentially medical imaging, based off of those neuropsychological tests that you can do, and especially if it's a change over time, which is why some of those baseline going back every year to do all of these things, hearing included, is important because that change over time is really meaningful and helpful for understanding kind of any kind of diagnosis. Alzheimer's disease now, there's actually a blood-based biomarker that they can test for certain medications for memory to try to help with memory changes. And so I say all of this to say that everyone's trajectory is different. It's very hard to predict how anyone is going to do on this trajectory, when they might transition, how they might transition, and if they will transition across these points. But what that means from our perspective is that if we're thinking about functional ability and how hearing relates to all of that, it's very hard to study this, which is why it's been hard for us to get this information, and while we're continually trying to learn more and more that we can to be able to understand and pinpoint how someone's going to do, we cannot do. So anything that I'll share today, I am talking about at a population level, not at an individual level. So if we think about a broader group of people, what is the risk from hearing loss on dementia or cognitive decline, for example, but not a one-on-one based assessment, if that makes sense. Okay, so because of that complexity of how we're able to diagnose and identify dementia, or those different aspects of dementia, those different subtypes of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body disease, for example, and the fact that we have still, for most types of dementia, no known cure and a potentially long preclinical phase where changes are happening but we aren't seeing symptoms, and knowing globally that over 55 million people are currently living with dementia globally, not just in the United States, that this is a global problem. Almost all of the focus, primarily at least from the public health perspective, is on prevention and intervention for dementia as opposed to a cure. So we're looking for ways that what are the things that we can do to try to slow any potential progression, either any onset of symptoms or progression of those symptoms over time. And I recognize that this is very small, but I'm going to make this larger in a minute so that you can see this a little bit more. But essentially, a handful of years, almost 9 years ago at this point, an international body, an international grouping of experts on dementia prevention and intervention, I should say, pooled together all of their evidence of what do we know so far about how we can potentially prevent dementia cases from a global perspective. And what they essentially did is they came to an understanding with all of this information that about 45% of dementia cases could potentially be prevented or are modifiable. Meaning another portion of that is related to genetic-based factors or things that we don't necessarily think we have an understanding of how to potentially modify, but a large proportion of those we could potentially do something about. And when I say modifiable, this is with the assumption that these 12 identified factors might cause dementia. We don't know for sure. We need to learn a lot more information. Some of these we know more than others. But there's 13 in this particular study, starting from early life through midlife and late life, that they identified could potentially be prevented for, could be intervened on to prevent dementia cases. So what are those factors? Hopefully this is a little bit larger to see. So their identified factors are physical inactivity, I can't see from there, smoking, excessive alcohol consumption, air pollution, head injuries or traumatic brain injuries more specifically, or frequent concussion, infrequent social contact, so social isolation or withdrawal, less education, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, depression, hearing impairment, high LDL cholesterol, and vision loss. Some of these I think we've known for a while, others are kind of more in their emerging state, but generally at some phase of life or throughout life, these are things that we can often to some extent do something about to try to help prevent ourselves for potential cognitive declines later. And one of the things that they did was they looked at across all of the studies and how strong the evidence was for each of these risk factors and how common each of these identified risk factors are. They tried to say, well, what is the potential biggest modifiable risk factor that we can see? And they ultimately found that hearing loss and management of hearing loss can prevent up to 7% of dementia cases, or I should say up to 7% of dementia cases could potentially be prevented with the management of hearing loss. This is one of the largest factors of all of those identified risk factors that we can see. Education, we know, has been one for a long time, but that's about 5%. There's a couple other, high LDL cholesterol is another potential risk factor. And we landed on hearing loss having that largest risk factor really for kind of two particular reasons. One is that hearing loss presents a reasonably high risk for dementia in the studies that have been compiled. I'll show that evidence in just a second for you. But it's not the highest risk factor for of all of these. It's reasonably high, but actually evidence of having depression, especially prolonged depression or multiple episodes of depression, can increase your risk in education. Other risk factors present higher risk for dementia than hearing loss does. What's important for dementia from a population perspective of dementia prevention is that is incredibly common. Like Ariella just said, up to 2/3 of individuals over the age of 65 have some degree of meaningful hearing loss. Very few of these risk factors are as common in the population. So if you're thinking about prevention of hearing loss and even potentially intervention, from a population perspective, that's why hearing loss has such a big bang for its buck. While it does present a higher risk, and I'll show that, and if you're curious, I can show it in comparison to the other risk factors, it's the combination of these two that is kind of driving some of those headlines that you might have seen in the media in the past year. When this came out, this is the 4th time this has been updated, and it makes big news splashes in the mainstream media every single time it comes out. But this is partially, it needs a little bit more context than what some of those are describing. And we could talk about that more if you're curious. And the other thing I want to be sure to highlight is that increased dementia risk does not guarantee that you will get dementia. Like I mentioned before, what I'm presenting today is thinking about a population level. If we looked at everybody on average with hearing loss, they present a higher risk, but that doesn't account for all of your own individual-based life experiences that contribute to what your own cognitive trajectory might look like. But it's useful to know what are the things that I might be able to do to protect myself as best as I'm able to from cognitive decline or dementia later on. So what does that risk actually look like? Well, of all of the studies on hearing loss and dementia that they looked at from the start of time, some of the first evidence of studies on this came out of was in the 1980s, and then there was a really slow build-up period, and in the last 10 years it's kind of exploded. They've only found 6 studies that met their strict standards of scientific research for inclusion in this study. And ultimately, what they found, I'm just trying to highlight kind of this arrow or this circle right here. Most of the studies presented that individuals with hearing loss compared to those without had higher risk of, I say cognitive decline here because we have better evidence for that. So changes in those cognitive test scores, for example, over time compared to a diagnosis because that's more complicated. Had about a 40% higher risk for cognitive decline compared to those without hearing loss over a period of time. And so why might that be? And this is where we are still gathering our evidence. This is the proposed theories of why might hearing loss present this increased risk and higher association for cognitive decline or dementia for individuals. Thinking about why might hearing loss cause these aspects. We still don't know that's the case. We just know that a lot of evidence is suggesting that there is something there. And there's a handful of different theories related to this. One is that what we call a common cause, so that something else is contributing to both of these conditions to where that's presenting like that it looks like there's a higher risk. One thought is that just general neurodegeneration with age, vascular disease, for example, because that can lead to potential hearing loss as well as dementia. But if that's the case, we can't really, doing something about your hearing is not going to necessarily change your dementia risk. It's this focus that we've had, especially from a clinical focus, that we have a lot more attention on, because that's maybe something where we can act to intervene for this potential increased risk. So we know that prolonged hearing loss with decreased stimulation to the brain can ultimately change brain structure and function. Without that increased auditory stimulation, especially over time, there are changes to the gray matter and white matter in the brain. That can add to what's already happening for these different underlying causes of dementia. This might be especially the case if someone has not used hearing aids, for example, for their hearing loss, because hearing aids help add that auditory stimulation back. And so possibly these changes to brain structure from hearing loss add and contribute further to those already happening for different pathologies for dementia, ultimately leading to that increased symptom presentation that goes along with dementia. Another potential theory is that hearing loss and that increased cognitive ability for the brain to process speech and understanding with that decreased input that it's receiving increases cognitive demands on the brain that can help an individual compensate for any symptom presentation that they're having for those different diagnoses of dementia. It's called this idea of cognitive load and cognitive reserve. The brain is using more resources to help understand what's being said, and those resources are pulled away from what they generally could be doing to help offset any cognitive changes that are happening. Another idea, what we have labeled here as other mediating factors, is that other risk factors, some of which were on that slide a few minutes ago, we know hearing loss can contribute to, and those risk factors in and of themselves present increased risk for dementia and cognitive decline. The things that we focused on most specifically are social isolation and withdrawal. Individuals sometimes with hearing loss, depending on kind of their personality, their life experiences, their listening experiences, can stop going to those activities or engaging in different types of environments or social activities that they once did. And we know that social isolation and withdrawal can increase your risk for dementia or cognitive decline. We also know that hearing loss can present some increased risk for depression or depressive symptomatology. I think there's a host of both biological and social-based reasonings for that. And depressive symptoms or depression can increase risk for dementia and cognitive decline. Physical activity is one other thing that we've kind of been thinking about as it relates to that. So these are all different theories. There's been research on all of these and evidence suggesting all of these to some related extent. But the reality is we don't know what is the driving factor of that relationship. And the reality is also that it's probably some combination of this and probably individual to the person. We just don't know what that looks like yet. It's going to take a lot more research for us to understand what that might look like. But to give a little bit more context for why might we be seeing this association that we've been hearing about. So this is association. What if we do something about our hearing loss? Does that decrease my potential risk for cognitive changes or a population level, again, let me correct myself, risk for changes in cognitive ability? And combining the evidence that we know so far, which really is not a lot, and there's a variety of reasons for that, generally, it suggests that if you do something about your hearing loss, traditionally we think about it in the way of use of a hearing aid to manage your hearing loss, that presents about a 20% reduction in risk for cognitive decline or changes in cognitive abilities compared to those that have unmanaged hearing loss over time. Suggesting that potentially, acting on hearing loss, which is, while it can be expensive depending on what you're looking at, compared to some of the other risk factor interventions, is relatively low risk compared to some of these other potential risk factors, can reduce an individual's risk of cognitive changes over time, it seems to suggest. And I do have one study that I want to pinpoint that specifically looked at that, and I say this because this got a lot of media attention within the last couple of years. This is the ACHIEVE study. It's been the first long-term randomized clinical trial, which is generally what we consider kind of the gold standard of research, on asking, does a hearing intervention, a best practice hearing intervention, affect brain health in older adults? If we have older adults with hearing loss and we do our best practice hearing intervention, does that actually change risk for, they actually looked at all of these different health-related outcomes, but their main focus was on cognitive decline over time. This study was really hard to do and really expensive. And so it's the best evidence that we sort of have so far on understanding if we do something about hearing loss, does that decrease that risk? And to give a little bit more context to this study, because I think just telling you that information is one thing, but understanding how they got to this is a little bit more helpful to be more informed on kind of how to interpret this study. So this study was done in 977 participants. It was kind of housed within a longer-term study of older adults that's focused on 4 different sites across the country. This is called the ERIC study. One location is in Hagerstown, Maryland, and then locations in North Carolina, Minnesota, and thank you, Mississippi, I could see from here. I should look here instead of over there. And so what they essentially did was they took individuals from that existing long-term, the study started in 1987, and they've been following these individuals for that long, or new individuals that they recruited from the community. And that included 977 different participants. They started the study at the ages of 70 to 84 years. All of these individuals had hearing loss, but was untreated hearing loss. None of them had started to use hearing aids. And they all, at the start of study, had what we call normal cognitive abilities within this age range. And they divided these groups into 2 groups. One is what we call our best practice hearing intervention. So they got all the bells and whistles of not only hearing aids, but also all of the appropriate counseling and support that comes with appropriate hearing-based intervention care. Or they compared that to a group that got what you might be called like your best practice healthy education control. They learned about diet, physical activity, sleep, all of these other things that can just promote staying healthy for an individuals. And they followed those individuals, comparing the two groups over time for 3 years, doing cognitive testing and a variety of other pieces of information to see, is there an effect of, or what is the effect of this hearing intervention on cognitive change compared to kind of this healthy education control that still got useful information but wasn't focused on hearing. And they looked at these specific outcomes with the main focus, again, being cognitive decline, but they were looking at social isolation, physical activity, brain structure, to see if that intervention changed the brain structure that we can see later. And the short story of the finding is that hearing intervention itself did not change cognition in everyone. If you looked at all 977 individuals together, there was no significant effect of that hearing intervention on cognitive decline ability after that 3-year time period. But they did observe that there was a significantly slowed cognitive decline up to 48%, which is kind of astronomical from any other cognitive-based intervention that's out there, for those that were at higher risk for dementia to begin with, those that had some of more health conditions, that had more of those risk factors that I showed a little bit earlier. Hearing intervention really seemed to have an impact on those individuals. And so it suggests, at least, what's happening right now, I should say, is this study is continuing for another 3 years to see if we give a little bit more time, do we see cognitive benefits in all individuals, more so in the hearing or not? To see 3 years and the span of cognitive change can really not be that long for some individuals. Trying to see if more time makes a difference, the study is ongoing. But it does suggest that hearing care could be one meaningful way to protect brain health. And benefits are being shown in other domains of healthy aging as well, including social isolation and some of those other risk factors that they're seeing. They're seeing benefits just for healthy aging more broadly, not necessarily just cognitive decline. So we'll know in 2 more years what the effects of that second phase of the study is and if we see that benefit across the board for individuals. There we go.
Okay, so what can be done? Some risk prevention. So what can be done to overall minimize your risk? So you can take care of your good senses. So get your hearing and vision checked regularly. Use those hearing aids or those glasses that you have if needed. That can help keep your brain stimulated with those neurons keep working. Let your doctor know if you're having trouble hearing or seeing. And if you're noticing memory changes, make sure you let your doctor know as well. Keeping your senses sharp can make conversations easier, they can help you stay social and independent, and it can reduce confusion and frustration. So how treating hearing loss may reduce your risk for other conditions. So some other things that can be affected are falls and balance issues. So we know that the hearing organ is also closely related to your balance. So hearing supports that spatial awareness and the balance, and treatment can support that stability and reduce that fall risk. Depression, anxiety, and social isolation is something that we've already discussed, but hearing loss may lead to that withdrawal and loneliness. So treatment can support the emotional well-being. Overall quality of life can be affected by hearing loss as well. So it's linked to other health conditions and common in older individuals. It may impact the ability to effectively communicate and engage with your care team. So with your doctors, things like that, it may be a little bit more difficult to engage with them if you don't have the resources to help you in those conversations. And so better hearing can equal better engagement, independence, and healthcare communication. So what this means for healthy aging. We are learning more and more every day with research. Hearing loss is common and it is also treatable. Hearing affects communication, engagement, and independence. It is one of the leading modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline. Prevention and early attention matter. And then overall, a baseline understanding of your overall health can be just as important. So getting that baseline to understand where you are and keep checking in with those doctors.
So we kept this short because I didn't know what direction you would want to go. So there's plenty of time for questions. This is my contact or our contact information if you have other questions. I also, thank you, want to say if anybody is curious about getting connected to hearing care, again, this is not meant to be a clinic promotion, but just in case you're curious. We both have information for the University of Maryland clinic, where Ariella has been training for our clinical faculty here, as well as there is an office related to the Family Hearing Center in a building here on campus that has a lot of different services that they offer. One of the audiologists, this is the audiology team, is over here if you would like to ask some clinical focused questions or understand where she is on this very large and beautiful campus. That way you don't have to travel elsewhere. She is here. This is information related to them as well, in case you're interested in getting connected to hearing care in some way. Questions on that? Talk about your thing in a minute. He's in charge.
Question on what's your funding source?
Great question. So my funding source has been the Alzheimer's Association and the National Institute on Aging, so far. I'm early in the game, but so far that's what it's been.
So is it a myth that men are more affected with hearing loss than women? Is that a myth?
Yeah, no. Good question. I wouldn't call it a myth, but I would say there's more context for it. Hearing loss is more common in men. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. One is traditionally lifestyle factors. Again, traditionally. Men have been kind of putting themselves in more at-risk type of situations for hearing loss, whether that's noise exposure from guns, military, power tools, construction, farming, any of those things. Other things just generally, I talk at a population level again, men are more common to have some of the other risk factors that can lead to hearing loss, like smoking and physical activity, cardiovascular disease, those other kinds of things. That changes around the age of menopause. Women start to catch up. Part of the idea related to that is that there's some evidence to suggest that estrogen is actually protective against hearing loss based off of where it is and how like the metabolism or the energy sources of the cochlea, the organ of hearing. And when women hit menopause, obviously that estrogen starts to change. While for a period of time, men, it's more common, it kind of starts to even out around the age of menopause. And then stays that way just because women are still continuing to live a little bit longer. So some biological, mostly behavioral aspects for that. I have to wait for the microphone.
What software are you using to display the closed captions in real time?
I don't know. Jesse knows that information. PowerPoint, I'm assuming.
Raspberries?
Is it good? Is it accurate? Okay, great. PowerPoint, I think. Yeah.
I'm curious how you tease apart in your study the hearing loss and the social contact amount, and also was there any intervention part to your study, or did you simply ask these people what they did as they went along? Because there could have been intervention by grabbing some people and saying, let us give you some hearing aids. I didn't know, it didn't sound interventional.
So can you give me a little bit more context of what, was there a specific slide or portion that you were talking about? Because you're right, hearing loss and how we think about that can mean a variety of different things. So explain a little bit more.
Well, what I mean is, if the hearing, were you simply observing the hearing loss, or what were some of the people somehow getting an intervention with hearing aids or other devices?
Are you referring to that Achieve study that I presented, or just any of the studies that I was talking about?
Oh, I'm talking about the specific study you talked about the most.
This guy, this one. This study?
Yes.
Yeah, so the hearing, I can't walk away from here. There were two different groups in this particular study. So a randomized control trial, you have your experimental group, and then you have what you would call your control group. Ethically, we can't give a whole group hearing intervention and then give the other group nothing. So the other control group got a well-established and validated health education kind of curriculum and training, a whole education program. The hearing intervention group for this, again, all of these individuals had hearing loss, diagnosed and clinically tested hearing loss. The hearing intervention group got hearing aids. They got all of the audiological care and follow-up and counseling and everything else related to that over that 3-year time period. And from a best practice research standpoint, they didn't get any of the health education-based control components, talking about engaging in social engagement, for example, or anything else. This group, once the study ended, did get the option of going towards to get hearing aids as well. We have to maintain our ethics with all of that. But did that answer your question?
So my question is, there was no particular intervention to get some group to be more socially active?
No, the intervention was not specifically related to that, but social interaction at baseline before the intervention and then throughout was measured in both groups.
Thank you.
We were just looking at that. They looked at, did that change between the hearing intervention or just the health education? They looked at that in both, yes.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could maybe go in a little deeper on something that seemed to be working at cross purposes, and maybe I didn't understand correctly, or maybe they're just things do work. But earlier on you said higher levels of education seem to protect hearing, be a protective thing, but then later on something like more cognitive activity seemed to be detrimental toward hearing loss. There were two different earlier on, you said the higher education levels seemed to protect it. Then later on, you said increased cognitive action seemed to detract from hearing. That's what I got from your
The cognitive
presentation.
load.
Maybe I misunderstood.
No.
Could you go deeper into it?
Let me see if I'm understanding the slide maybe where was it related to this particular slide?
That's the second part. Then earlier you said higher levels of education, which means more cognitive activity.
Yeah, so
Higher
maybe,
that seem to protect hearing. They seem
Yeah.
to be at cross purposes.
so let me
Could
see
you
if
explain?
so this related to education being a risk factor for cognitive decline or dementia. We know that lower education in early life, I'm sorry if I didn't say lower education, less education in early life can increase kind of risk for cognitive change later on. There's a lot of theory related to that and a variety of aspects to that. So less education can increase dementia risk later. And then potentially the second component of that was related to the potential, like why might we see this relationship? And so this middle section is what I'm assuming you're referring to. So we know generally, even separate from thinking about this in a dementia space, the presence of hearing loss and being able to put together speech, especially in a noisy situation, takes a lot of cognitive ability and processing. It takes a lot of effort for the brain to make sense and follow that information. That cognitive effort can take away from cognitive resources that the brain has to overcome some of those dementia symptom presentations. And so that's where hearing loss can increase that risk, because the brain is working much harder to do multiple things with hearing loss compared to those without hearing loss. Does that clarify a little bit? I think so. Different stages of life and different things that we're thinking about, yeah. Yeah, we do know that higher education decreases risk for hearing loss, not because it's education itself, it's everything that comes with education can decrease your risk for hearing loss.
I'm wondering, a more basic question, have there been studies with the loss of vision and dementia?
Yes. I don't have any information. It is one of the risk factors identified, more newly identified. It's kind of emerging as far as kind of the strength of that evidence. A lot of the studies have been on those, not what we call refractive error. So not what you do for your glasses, but those more longer-term macular degeneration, cataracts, those forms of vision loss. But there is some research related to that as well. How the brain processes visual input and auditory input are very, very different. And so while they're thought of synonymously, they're ultimately a little bit different. But there is research related to that. There's also research related to the presence of both conditions, dual sensory impairment, hearing and vision loss, and what that looks for cognitive-based changes as well, and how management affects that. And that is more mixed as far as some studies are seeing one is more important, some are seeing the other. It's probably very dependent on a lot of different things.
Two questions. One, I recently saw something where exercise was important in some sort of a precursor protein in the brain to help memory. And I was wondering whether there was anything in research coming up that might be similar to not memory, but other factors in dementia, where there is a physical change secondary to exercise.
So separate from hearing, but related to exercise and physical changes.
Yeah. I don't know whether it was a protein or some sort of a factor, but it was a physical substance. It wasn't.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're getting a little bit more out of my wheelhouse.
But just as it concerns hearing, is there anything going on?
For hearing, I'm sorry?
Yeah, any physical thing that's found, either blood work or cerebrospinal fluid or something, which changes with exercise that might lead to
this relationship based thing here.
A change of hearing ability.
Yeah. So there's a variety of different things that we've been looking at. There was a bigger study, I have a slide on it that's separate from what you're asking about, that came out last summer. It was called the Finger Trial. That was also very published, that looked at the specific access of how much physical activity and then the brain or the biological-based changes as well, the blood-based biomarkers, for example. In the hearing world, separate from the physical activity-based question, there has been some studies trying to look at hearing loss and some of those blood-based biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease, for example. So the beta amyloid, the tau, looking at if there's any kind of relationship between those. That's a little bit different of this kind of path of what causes what. If we drew it out, that would look a little bit different. Very mixed evidence suggesting anything of that. From that biological perspective, from physical activity and what that means for mitochondria, for example, and how the body processes strains and other kind of neurotransmitter type pieces of information. There's been less of that. Part of that is based off of how we have hearing collected in research. Generally, large research studies do not do a very good job of including hearing besides self-report. And so having the data to do that has been really hard, and thinking about how long has a person had hearing loss and what does that mean for those biological changes. Most likely, I would speculate related to that. That's more related to the changes in hearing that we see more common with age, what we call age-related hearing loss, which is not age itself, but it's the biological changes that can happen over time with wear and tear, that physical activity is one thing that can help prevent against that. I don't know if I directly answered your question, but I would say to answer your question, very limited and not really. We've looked at hearing and physical activity, but not so much really from a biological perspective to be able to say anything one way or the other.
My second question is really not a question, but a comment. In the ACHIEVE study, you just outlined that one group got hearing aids and good hearing care, and the other group did not. And this went on for 3 years. Yet you're saying that early treatment is important. How is that justified in that study? It just seems like you're saying two things that you know,
Yeah.
and yet we want a randomized study, but
Talk to the study designers.
yeah.
So my understanding of how they justified this, I'm tangentially sort of, I was not involved in this study. But essentially, we know that individuals who adopt hearing aids themselves, like self-seeking for hearing care, are fundamentally different than those who don't. And so if we just rely on individuals that get hearing aids themselves, that's ultimately, from a research perspective, going to be a biased inclusion of individuals. And so that's one of the reasons why, to be able to look at this, we had to give the control group something else that we know has validated and has proven to be beneficial for cognitive trajectories over time. But we did not include the hearing-based component. Now, all of these individuals had hearing loss. All of them were aware that they would not be getting hearing aid specifically at the start of the study, but after the 3-year time period, they would be eligible to seek hearing aids if they chose to. So that is how they ethically justified, for lack of a better phrase, kind of providing hearing aids to one group and then providing this other well-known and validated kind of beneficial program to another group. And then they were allowed to switch afterwards. We can talk more about it, but I wasn't the study designer, just the messenger. Yeah.
So did everybody in the group that got hearing aids had the same hearing aid?
Yes,
Well,
but it was all individually programmed for their hearing loss.
Are there significant differences in types of hearing aids or brands that would?
Yeah, great question. Ultimately there are differences, what I call it significant differences. For the purposes of what this study was looking at, not necessarily. They all got the same type of hearing aid, and then it became individualized, kind of that best practice care afterwards on how the hearing aids were fit and programmed and to be able to meet that individual person's needs. But there are differences in devices, but significant differences, I wouldn't say so, but they all got the same ones.
I need clarification on one of the earlier slides. I need clarification on one of the earlier slides.
Oh, there you are. Yeah, okay.
It was the one, it had Alzheimer's, and then it had Lewy, and then several other things, and you only talked about the Alzheimer's, you didn't talk about the other things on that slide.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as to what the other things were and a little more explanation of them.
Sure, I can do that briefly. These are other different types of dementia diagnosis. So types being different known, each of these have different underlying biological, what we would call etiologies, changes in the body that happen. from different sources. So I talked about Alzheimer's disease, one, because it's what I'm most familiar with, but it's also what's the most common, and kind of gets pegged as what most individuals would have without going through specific diagnosis of these others. So each of these have, again, different underlying pathology and different symptom-based presentations. So like Lewy body vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, they present differently as far as what the patient might be experiencing. Some are more related to kind of executive function and mood-based changes that are seen. Alzheimer's disease is the hallmark is memory-based changes. That's why when people think about dementia, they think about memory-based loss. Does that sort of answer your question without going too much into the weeds?
What were the others? I can't read them
Oh,
from
I'm sorry.
here.
It's
What- can you-
Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and then Parkinson's disease, like other-based dementias like Parkinson's-based cognitive changes.
And can you say a little something about the difference between these things?
I did the extent of what I'm going to be able to give you off the cuff.
Okay. So you don't know much about, except for the Alzheimer's?
I know more about the Alzheimer's. The research that I have been is more lumped into cognitive-based changes or a little bit of the Alzheimer's pathology. I wouldn't want to tell you the wrong information.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. I have one last plug for Ariella's graduate capstone thesis. If anybody here, I have a slide for it, has a significant hearing loss to where they had a cochlear implant evaluation, knows somebody with a cochlear implant, knows what a cochlear implant even is to start out with, she is conducting an interview just on their experience of those evaluations and those clinic visits to try to identify disparities in the care received and how we can improve that process. So find her if you have any information or have gone through that process or know someone who might be interested in just doing a